In the history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the popularity and types of stun decks have always ebbed and flowed, but with the release of high-speed riders, the dawn of a new, very archetype-specific stun deck is on the horizon, the PSYFrames. What makes PSYFrames potentially much more dangerous than any of the stun decks of the past, even something like Dino Rabbit, is that almost all of the stun attributes occur from the hand, and furthermore can be simple jumping off points for even larger and more dangerous plays. However, some are down on the potential of PSYFrames due to the critical weakness they believe exists in the deck. Fortunately for PSYFrame supporters, most of the flaws of this deck can be remedied by proper deck design. PSYFrames are a genuine threat to be a Tier 1 deck, even with its low quantity. Note, that was quantity, not quality, of direct support. Looking at the direct support first, PSYFrame Driver is a generic level 6 2500 attack point monster that is the centerpiece for the entire deck. While on its own, Driver is rather meaningless. Running it is essential to activate the effects of the other PSYFrame monster and tap in the Synchro well to advance the offensive capacity of the deck. However, for me, running 3 copies is a little too much due to bad draw potential, as you want to summon this card from your deck or graveyard, not from the hand. For me, 2 copies is appropriate. Among the 5 remaining monsters in the PSYFrame deck, 4 of the 5 represent a form of negation that requires the controller to have no monsters on the field, and the other one is a searcher that requires no monsters on the field. Starting off, Epsilon is probably the least valuable of the PSYFrame monsters in my opinion due to its trap negation. On its face, trap negation is typically a good thing. However, for a PSYFrame deck, this type of trap negation tends to be inefficient because what traps do player B activate when player A doesn't have any monsters on the field? The only real traps that should be activated under these conditions are usually the continuous floodgate-like traps, like Vandy's Emptiness, Lose One Turn, Mistake, etc., etc. However, for a PSYFrame deck, a number of these floodgate cards aren't actual threats. Therefore, I typically only run 1 copy of Epsilon for emergency situations or the odd occurrence when activating it is actually possible. Delta is similar to Epsilon in that its activation is more rare than one might think. Delta is more side deck necessary than Epsilon, in that for some decks it is devastating, like Nekroz, and it also hurts Shadal, but against most decks, there again, similar to Epsilon, there just aren't a lot of spell cards that are activated by the opponent when you don't have any monsters on the field. Again, I do run 1 copy kind of for backup. Gamma might as well be an amalgamation of Effect Veiler, Ghost Ogre Snow Rabbit, and Chemical X. It's a fantastic card for not only does it negate monster effects, but it destroys the negated monster and summons itself and Driver, setting up a level 8 Synchro play. Since monster effects are the chief aspect of speed and advantage in most of the high competitive decks, I run 3 copies. Beta is also another important aspect of the PSYFrame deck, for it not only eliminates the direct attack, but it also destroys the monster and sets up a level 7 Synchro play, and to top it off, it actually ends the battle phase. If Gamma was the combination of Veiler, Snow Rabbit, and Chemical X, then Beta might as well be the combination of Battle Fader, Swordsman of Revealing Light, and Chemical J. However, due to deck space, I can only find room to run 2 copies despite wanting to run 3 copies. In my opinion, Alpha is the most important monster in the PSYFrame deck, for it is the Stratos of the deck. With the critical importance of PSYFrame Circuit, running 3 copies of Alpha, in my opinion, is pretty much essential because you have to make sure you get that circuit onto the field. Otherwise, a lot of the offensive capacity of the PSYFrame aspect of a PSYFrame deck basically just shuts down. PSYFrame Lord Omega is one of the most annoying cards in the PSYFrame arsenal, as it is a quasi-life force sword on legs with 2800 attack points that can limit the options and combo potential of the opponent, as well as set appropriate conditions for PSYFrame activation by removing itself from the field. It also helps rescue banished cards and graveyard residing Synchro monsters, as well as others, but a vast majority of the time you'll get the Synchro monsters out. 2 copies work well. PSYFrame Lord Zeta is also another beautiful card for this deck. The ability to remove the biggest threat on the field indefinitely in a loop, if so desired. Every time Zeta comes back, you just remove what it just removed previously again, can be devastating for the opponent. Overall, this card really should be splashed into probably any deck that can consistently make level 7 synchros. Due to its generic summoning condition, it's just that good. Not only does it have its removal effect that can eliminate the biggest threat, and also clear your field of monsters to reactivate PSYFrames, but it has a self-revival effect of sorts, allowing players to move it from the graveyard to the extra deck, but in addition, also getting to add a PSYFrame monster from the graveyard to your hand. So, hey, more bonus. Bonus is always good. 2 copies are appropriate. PSYFrame Circuit is pretty much the lifeblood of the Synchro capacity for this deck outside of Alpha. All of the other PSYFrame monsters will be banished before you have the opportunity to use them in a Synchro play without Circuit. The secondary attack boosting effect is a nice ability, as well as giving this deck a number of Blackwing Kalute type effects, depending on what is in the hand at the time. For all the level 2 PSYFrame monsters do have 4 figures of attack points. The funny thing is that there are a number of times when the opponent will actually forget about this attack modifying effect on Circuit and attack into a Zeta with, let's say, like a Trishula or something, and then lose the monster due to the discard of a Gamma. 3 copies of Circuit are a must. PSYFrame Overload is the best card in the deck, period. I have seen a number of PSYFrame builds early on here only run 1 or 2 copies of this card, which makes no sense. Run this card at 3 while you can for when the January or April or whatever 2016 ban list comes around. Probably in April, because normally the ban list is a little behind on dealing with power cards. This card will probably be limited to 1, and it will never go beyond 1 again. Overload is the card that saves your bacon when you don't have the right PSYFrame monster in hand to neutralize an opponent's play, or when you don't have Circuit on the field and you don't have anything ready in your hand to deal with those cards being banished. What is really fantastic about this card is that you can use PSYFrame monsters on the field. So if you summon a beta, basically because your opponent has attacked, but you don't have Circuit on the field, instead of just letting that beta be banished during the end phase, you can use Overload to banish the beta and take an opponent's card with it. Furthermore, the fact that the opponent's card is banished face down means that it's never coming back for the remainder of the duel. The fact that your PSYFrame monsters are not banished face down, unlike those opponent cards, is even more nasty because you can recover those PSYFrame monsters later and use them again to banish even more. Finally, when my opponent actually sends this card to the graveyard, I get to remove it from play, and I get to search for any PSYFrame card except for their Overload. Wait, this card can be removed from play for a search. Isn't there a card that allows the return of banished cards to the graveyard? Yeah, when Omega is on the field during the opponent's standby phase, it can return 1 banished card to the graveyard. So Overload and Omega can produce a continuous combo loop that basically adds 1 PSYFrame monster from your deck to your hand once per turn. Remove Overload during your turn, return it to the graveyard during your opponent's turn. Yeah, this card is definitely getting limited in the future, so as previously stated, play it at 3 while you can. Alright, after a very positive direct support analysis, because the deck knows what it wants to do and does it very well, what else does this deck need to succeed? The 2 most important elements are speed and monster support that does not interfere with the ability of the PSYFrame monsters to activate from the hand. Basically, this deck needs monsters that remove themselves from the field before an opponent's turn or early in the opponent's turn. While there are a number of random monsters that can be splashed into this archetype that have little synergy with each other, fortunately for PSYFrame monsters and their deck runners, there is another specific archetype that meets this criteria, in addition to have very useful associated effects. Yosenjus. In large context, there really, in my opinion, could not be a better, on a realistic level, not a fantasy level, set of monsters to complement a PSYFrame deck. Among the possible Yosenju options, I like to run 2 copies of Kama 1, 2 copies of Kama 3, and 2 copies of Tsujik. I don't like Kama 2 in this deck because it does not bring anything helpful to the party involving PSYFrames outside of its spirit-like effect, for direct attacking is really not valuable for this type of a deck. Kama 1's bounce ability is great for clearing the road for minor swarming or working in combination with something like Omega. Kama 3 is nice for additional damage and deck thinning through searching to make sure you have responses when lacking the right types of PSYFrame monsters. Just like the standard Yosenju deck, Tsujik is your power. In my experience, 6 Yosenjus work nicely, so at least 2 of the 3 are available rather consistently in your hands so you can get the most out of them. Yosenjus also help neutralize the take it slow strategy that a number of players have in response to dueling PSYFrame due to concerns about getting their effects negated and setting up your special summons. Basically, the swarming effects of Yosenju put pressure on your opponent to push the action. Finally, closing up the monsters, running 3 copies of Cardcar D is pretty much basically a staple in this deck because it works very nicely due to the fact that you need to tribute it to get its effect, netting 2 cards, and due to the counter attributes of the PSYFrame monsters, the fact that activating Cardcar D ends the turn is of little consequence. For the remainder of the spells, I run the standard 3 staples, 1 Raigeki, 1 Book of Moon, 1 Soul Charge. Dark Holes are typically not needed for this deck because of the effects of Gamma and Beta. Also, because a vast majority of special summoning done by this deck will occur during the opponent's turn, 3 copies of Pot of Duality work very nicely to increase the probability of getting what you want for the given situation. Finally, there are a couple of standard Psychic support cards that are very effective additions to this deck. First, Psychic Feel Zone is a secondary means to produce a synchro play using PSYFrame monsters that have been banished, either through Overlord's effect or through the effect of the PSYFrame monster itself, because you felt you needed to negate something your opponent was doing, even though Circuit wasn't on the field. The one potential drawback to Psychic Feel Zone is the summoned monster is in defense position, so summoning Omega or Zeta is usually the smart play with Feel Zone, because they can remove themselves while also producing some form of advantage. The other great support card is Psychic Path, which allows you to add up to 2 removed from play psychic monsters back to your hand for a mere 800 life points. Add betas and gammas back to your hand to further terrorize your opponent's monster summons. Add more ammunition back to the hand to use with Overload. Path is pretty much a ridiculously useful card in this deck, outside of having it on the first turn. Finally, for the trap cards, other than Overload, I simply run the 3 most important staples, 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, and 1 Solemn Warning. Obviously, Vandy's Emptiness should be shied away from for this deck because it shuts down your ability to use your negation effects associated with your PSYFrame monster. The extra deck is largely comprised of level 7 and 8 Synchro monsters for obvious reasons, but there's also some rank 4 XZ monsters due to the inclusion of the Yosenju monsters. I run 1 Hot Red Archfiend Dragon, field clearance for future Yosenju swarming, 1 Crimson Blader. It's an oldie, but it's still a goodie for shutting down Cosmos, Necros, Monarchs, various Pendulum decks. 1 Thought Ruler Archfiend. It's a quality psychic synchro with a nice effect that has high enough defense that it has a reasonable probability of surviving when summoned with Psychic Feel Zone if you don't have any more Zetas or Omegas. 1 Stardust Dragon offers secondary negation, especially during the player's turn. 1 Yazi, 2600 attack, can't be targeted. 1 Michael, banishing is almost always helpful. 1 Clearwing Synchro Dragon. And the 3 of the 4 rank 4 staples in 1 Exciton Knight, 1 number 101, and then instead of using Castel, I run Lightning Chidori because Yosenjus are wind. Lightning Chidori is kind of a slightly better version of Castel, and 1 XZ Dragon. It should be noted that Odd Eye's Meteor Burst Dragon is an excellent side deck for mirror matches, as it's basically a more powerful version of Armades, which in large part shuts down both Gamma and Beta. Overall, the only thing that really can stop a PSYFrame deck from being truly terrifying is it can be somewhat inconsistent. You don't get the right frames for the right situation, and it does slightly depend on reacting to your opponent's plays rather than completely dictating the tempo yourself. Fortunately, as mentioned above, the addition of the Yosenju monsters manages that second potential drawback fairly well, forcing your opponent to take some aggressive action, otherwise lose via Yosenju Swarm beatdown. If this archetype does not start capturing numerous top 8s or 16s at major tournaments, then really the only explanation can be people are just playing the deck or designing the deck wrong. Well, that is my PSYFrame deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.